And I would similarly, that's a bit good, right, here we go, come on. If he'd have written Strawberry Fields, I would write Penny Lane, you know.
For decades, two names have defined the story of modern music: Paul McCartney and John Lennon. Together they wrote songs that changed the world. Apart, they became symbols of something more complicated: creation and conflict. The Lennon-McCartney partnership was never just friendship or rivalry, it was both at once.
We were writing songs at each other.
Yes.
It's like weaponizing songs.
But behind the public barbs, the letters, the interviews and the silence was something deeper, a conversation that never really ended. And now, decades later, McCartney has finally spoken clearly about what really happened between them. It is not anger, it is memory. Here is the truth Paul McCartney finally revealed about his feud with John Lennon and why it still matters. The break heard around the world. It began not with shouting, but with silence. When the Beatles started to fracture, Paul McCartney and John Lennon were no longer partners in creation. They were opponents in direction. What had once been effortless collaboration now felt like collision. The breakup was not sudden. It was the slow unraveling of two visions that could no longer coexist. At the dawn of the 1970s, the dream was already dimming. Years of endless touring, recording and pressure had worn away the bond that once felt unbreakable. In the studio, glances turned sharp. Notes passed between takes replaced conversations. Paul wanted the discipline of a band that still believed in perfection. John wanted the freedom to dismantle the idea of being a Beatle. Neither was wrong, but both were done. The tension that once sparked creativity now only caused silence. George Harrison grew restless. Ringo briefly left, and each new session felt like a rehearsal for the end. The moment came quietly. John telling the others he wanted a divorce.
There was a meeting where John came in and said, hey guys, I'm leaving the group.
Paul sat still. He did not argue. He knew the era had already ended before the words were even spoken. Paul later explained, I did not break up the Beatles, the band was already breaking up. It was the truth that history refused to hear. When he filed the legal documents to dissolve the group, it was not betrayal. It was preservation. Alan Klein's management had divided loyalties and clouded decisions. Paul's move was defensive, not destructive. But the media saw rebellion where he saw responsibility. The villain label stuck, and the silence between the former friends deepened. John, meanwhile, had already chosen liberation. It is over, he told those close to him. Now I can be me. Those words carried relief and sorrow in equal measure. What the world saw as rivalry was, in truth, mourning. The quiet grief of two men losing the only language they had ever shared. The Beatles did not explode. They evaporated into separate melodies that still somehow harmonized, even apart. And in that silence, history mistook heartbreak for hostility. The letters and the lyrics. After the breakup, the tension did not fade. It transformed. Each man began speaking through music instead of conversation. Their songs became coded messages, sharp and personal, dissected by fans and critics alike. Beneath the public jabs, there remained an unspoken understanding that both were still listening, still responding, still unable to stop the dialogue that had defined them. When words failed, melody took over. Lennon's "How Do You Sleep" did not just sting, it roared. Every line sounded like a public reckoning. McCartney, blindsided, recognized the target but refused to fight fire with fire. His answer had already been written months before on Too Many People, a song Lennon had interpreted as a personal slight. Both men were right, both were wrong. Each had blurred the line between confession and accusation.
You one mistake, you made one in your head.
To outsiders, the feud seemed bitter and final, but beneath the lyrics, a pattern emerged. Their songwriting was still intertwined, still reacting, still in orbit around the other's gravity. When Lennon mocked yesterday, he was not just taunting Paul, he was measuring himself against his old partner's melodic instinct. When McCartney sang about too many people preaching practices, he was not just venting frustration, he was talking directly to John, even if neither would admit it. I thought, okay, he is upset, he is saying his piece, I get it, McCartney later said. That quiet acknowledgement revealed the truth behind the noise. Neither man stopped listening. In their own way, they were still collaborating, through echoes and rebuttals. What the press called a feud was, in fact, a form of communication that only they could understand. John once wrote privately, "We were like brothers." "We loved each other, but we were different." That line captured everything their music could not say aloud. Beneath the pride and provocation lived something unbreakable, an affection too stubborn to disappear, even when buried under sarcasm and sound. Their so-called rivalry was not destruction, it was continuation. Every song, every barb, every line of melody was part of a long, unfinished conversation, one carried not by words, but by harmony, the silent years between them. For years, distance replaced confrontation. The world believed they were enemies, but the truth was simpler. They were exhausted. Fame, business, and betrayal had blurred the friendship that once felt invincible. Yet time, as it often does, softened the edges. Somewhere between interviews and private letters, the silence began to shift back toward peace. The early 1970s saw both men rebuilding their identities in opposite directions. John Lennon stayed in New York, shedding the weight of the Beatles, diving into activism and domestic life with Yoko Ono. Paul McCartney retreated into the countryside, finding stability with Linda and forming Wings, a band that allowed him to breathe again. They were not ignoring each other, they were learning how to exist apart. The spotlight that had bound them now felt like a cage, and distance became the only kind of freedom they could both understand.
That's a really good song, that. I love that song. And I was like, yes, he likes it. You know, I've remembered it to this day.
Even as they built new lives, the shadow of their partnership lingered. Interviews often pulled them back into comparison. Journalists loved the narrative of Lennon the visionary and McCartney the craftsman, a rivalry more myth than reality. Both men bristled at it, but both also played their roles, weary of being reduced to half of something that no longer existed. Privately, however, the hostility had cooled. They had begun exchanging postcards and phone calls, small gestures that hinted at reconciliation. Paul later remembered one visit to New York where he dropped by unannounced. They spent the evening watching television, eating pizza, and laughing about old times. "It was just like the old days," he said. In that apartment, without cameras or questions, the past did not feel so heavy. They were not legends. They were two friends rediscovering normality. John spoke with warmth too. "Whatever differences we had, he is my family," he told an interviewer not long after. The feud that had once defined them was quietly dissolving. The competition, the ego, the noise, all replaced by mutual understanding. They no longer needed to prove anything. Time had done what argument never could. It did not erase their history. It made room for grace. The night everything stopped. When John Lennon was killed in New York, Paul McCartney's world fractured again. The feud that tabloids celebrated suddenly felt meaningless. In that moment, every unsent letter, every unsung apology became heavier. Grief turned reflection into regret. The world lost a Beatle. Paul lost his oldest friend. And the rivalry ended not in words, but in shock. The night of December 8th, 1980, is etched into music history, not for a performance, but for silence. Lennon had been returning home to the Dakota, a handful of autographs still fresh from earlier that day. News spread within minutes. Across the ocean, McCartney was in a recording studio, unaware that history had just shifted. A producer whispered the news. Paul froze. Then he muttered what the cameras would capture forever. A flat, stunned, "It is a drag."
It was just so horrific. You couldn't take it in, and I couldn't take it in.
That line haunted him for decades. People mistook it for coldness, but Paul later explained it was shock. Nothing could have prepared him for the idea that John was gone. "I just did not know what to say," he recalled. "I could not believe it. We had been getting close again." The two had been rebuilding their friendship, planning to meet up soon, joking over the phone about family, music, and memories. There was no grand reconciliation, just a quiet comfort, the kind shared by people who have already forgiven each other without saying the words aloud. In the weeks that followed, McCartney withdrew from public view. He avoided interviews, avoided reflection, but the grief began to pour into his writing. Out of that sorrow came Here Today, a song that would become his private letter to Lennon. He later said, "It is a song to John if he could hear me. It is everything I never got to tell him." Each line carried the weight of memory, the ache of unfinished conversation. It was not just a tribute, it was closure. For McCartney, Lennon's death was more than the loss of a bandmate. It was the end of the only dialogue that had ever truly defined him. The silence that followed was not peace, it was absence. And for Paul, that silence has never really lifted. the truth Paul finally told. Years later, McCartney began to speak openly, his tone quieter, his words stripped of defense. He no longer talked about who was right, only about what they had lost. He called Lennon his brother, his partner, his impossible equal. In telling the truth, Paul revealed what had always been there: love disguised as competition, memory disguised as music. The older McCartney became, the softer his recollections grew. Gone was the guarded performer who sidestepped questions about Lennon. In his place stood a man finally ready to let nostalgia take its place beside regret. The walls between myth and memory began to fall. What once felt too painful to revisit had become the only way to keep John alive. He started sharing stories that once lived only in silence. The laughter in the studio, the fights that ended with smiles, the unspoken trust that had carried them through chaos. In interviews, he admitted that their partnership was built on contradiction. He would bring the edge, I would bring the melody. Together, we made magic. There was no rivalry left to hide behind, only admiration. Paul no longer measured his success against Lennon's shadow. Instead, he celebrated how their differences had created balance. He told audiences that when he writes today, he still imagines John's voice in the back of his head, questioning, teasing, editing, guiding. During the McCartney 3-2-1 sessions with Rick Rubin, that reflection deepened. The music became a time machine, bringing Lennon back into the room. "I think about him all the time," McCartney confessed. "I dream about him. We are still writing songs together, really." The admission was not performance, it was peace. After years of restraint, Paul finally spoke without bitterness. The feud that once fueled headlines had never been about anger. It was about two creative souls trying to outdo each other out of love. For McCartney, truth arrived not as revelation, but as reconciliation. The rivalry was myth. The bond was real. Lennon's absence did not silence him. It gave his words deeper echo. And after half a century, Paul McCartney did not rewrite the story. He finished it with grace. In the end, the Lennon-McCartney story was never about rivalry. It was about reflection. Two young men who found each other in music, built something timeless, and spent the rest of their lives learning how to live beyond it. Their partnership shaped not only the Beatles, but the very rhythm of modern songwriting. It was brilliance, born from tension, unity, born from difference. McCartney's truth, spoken after decades of silence, reminds us that love often hides beneath the noise. What the world saw as competition was really connection, the kind too deep to fade, even after goodbye. Every time Paul steps onto a stage and sings the songs they wrote together, he keeps that bond alive, turning grief into gratitude. So what do you make of Paul's revelation about John? Share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more cinematic explorations into music's untold stories. Because some harmonies never die, they just keep playing on.